most of them were in the right direction, just not enough. We found our sex hypothesis was not supported. Again, 50-50 chance, guessed wrong. Story of my life. Our category hypothesis was supported, so we're happy. Our bike hypothesis was not. And after we saw this, we're like, something else has to be going on that we didn't necessarily take into account. This story has to be a little bit more complicated. So there's a lot of auxiliary factors that we identified. And I just wanted to break them down into three categories for us. The difference of age versus experience, some dietary factors, and bike type. So age, we found that age is actually positively correlated with T-score. That's not what we thought. There is an exception, though, that could have maybe skewed some of our data, was that Cat 1s are one of our youngest groups. These are pros, and they also have some of the lowest bone mineral densities in the entire group. And then the difference of experience. Years experience in racing are negatively correlated to T-score. This kind of makes sense, except with road racers. We're not really sure why that happens. We need to look further into that. Then we have dietary factors. Again, as I kind of previously elucidated to, was that total kcals is very important in maintaining bone mass. Hopefully that makes sense to you. If you're malnourished, not only are you going to lose fat mass, lean mass, but you're going to lose bone mass as well. Our study suggests that most of our cyclists were within energy balance because fat mass actually increased for almost every single cyclist over the season. Okay? But body mass didn't change. So you can't actually say that they were within energy balance without having our MAR information, knowing their RQ and their FQ. So those are assumptions that we can't necessarily make. But we did see a significant increase in fat mass for almost everyone. So we need to do a little bit better job of maybe controlling for that in the future. Like I said, maybe doing RMRs on everyone. And then those two dietary factors we think of for calcium and vitamin D, both were negatively correlated with T-score. Here, that doesn't make sense, right? And what I think is happening here is that a lot of our cyclists who were aware of low bone mineral density also reported supplementing vitamin D and calcium. So when the statistics are ran, you see someone who has a lot of calcium and vitamin D with a low bone mineral density. So we think that there's a little bit of knowledge there when they're trying to compensate for their lower mass. There's also another source of vitamin D that we didn't take into account. We had no way of actually measuring the environmental exposure to vitamin D based on these tan lines. Here's Dr. Browning, okay, right there, triathlete. Okay, here's Dr. Miller. And I'm not going to say who this is or who this is, but they're in this room. So last but not least is bike type. So we see here there's 0 males that are road racers only and are Cat 1s. We see a bit of a trend here. For some reason, guys, more so than women, as you move up categories, you somehow decide to race more bikes. Or maybe another way to look at it is guys start racing a lot of bikes and they get better and better and better, which allows them to move up cats. So that's kind of why we see this difference here. And we're not really sure why, and we didn't see that same trend within women. But that might also play into the fact that our mixed bike racers reported the most mileage, the most years riding and racing experience as compared to any other group. So that's something we need to take into account. All right, limitations of this study. We didn't have a control. Okay, so we can't assume that all the differences we saw in our group weren't maybe necessarily due to an outside factor. It's very unlikely, but we have to make that statement, of course. We use self-report data. Some people suggest that, especially with food logs, people can underreport by like 20% of their total kcals. So you have to take all that dietary information with a grain of salt because it is self-report data. We also didn't have a way to, well, we had a way, but we didn't objectively quantify concurrent and off-season physical activity. So we know that if someone is riding, but they're also maybe doing a lot of weightlifting, their skeletal mass is going to be going through a lot more external forces than maybe somebody else, and that could have played a role. And then energy demands, like I previously spoke about, was that we didn't do RMRs on folks. So we can't actually assume that people were in energy balance. Future endeavors, I would love, in fact, I hopefully will be addressing some of these soon. I'd love to extend the follow-up period to at least a year and really look at what does that off-season look like and increase the frequency of data collections. So instead of just doing pre-post, let's look at them 4 times throughout the year and really get a better grasp on what's happening in that pre-season, maybe in the middle of the season, the post-season, and then what we would look at in the off-season. we started off by maybe using Dr. Browning's lab and some of your accelerometers to objectively quantify physical activity, but it just didn't really work out this time. But I think that is a direction that needs to be taken in future endeavors. We can use these electronic training logs. A lot of racers and riders in general are using these. It's like a GPS. It can tell us mileage, grade, things like that. So that data would be really easy to get off of here and have them sent to us. And then lastly, I definitely want to ask the question, is there a difference between a rec rider, like me, I don't race, versus Ricky, who is a racer? Okay, regardless of what we're at. So we did see a difference between Tour de France riders and master riders, and then the folks we looked at. Is there also a difference between recreational riders who don't race? So in conclusion, cycling competitively, at least in our study, Cat 1 through 4, does not compromise bone health. So this is good news. And then we found the sex correlates are not the same for T-score because age, calcium, and lean mass percent were in opposite directions for males and females. So that definitely makes things a little tricky, and we need to research a little bit more about how these factors play a role because they were different for sex. And same with bike. These particular variables were in opposite directions for road racers versus mixed bike racers. So we need a lot more things need to be characterized, but we found some very interesting data. I'm very happy that we found it does not compromise bone health because that's not what I thought we'd find. So my question moving on, I think it's very important that we always come back to the big picture. Why does this matter? And where do we need to go from here? When, where, and why does cycling shift from what we've described as a safe activity, an osteogenic bone building activity, to a possibly dangerous sport, an osteoporotic sport as demonstrated by many others? And what are the factors that play into that? So with that, I'd like to say thank you, of course, to my committee. Heroic efforts over, especially the last week. I could not be here whatsoever without Dr. Reiser, Dr. Browning, Dr. Pellis. I appreciate it. Dr. Israel, he's not here, but I have to thank him for bringing me in. He took a chance. Don't look great on paper, so thank you. And of course, Dr. Braun. Dr. Hickey has been instrumental in my development as a person, so you have to thank him for that. And same with Dr. Bucky. I was very fortunate to be able to work with Dr. Court a little bit with UC Denver and collaborate with her. She's amazing. I have to say thank you to her. And also my mentor now at OU. She has also helped me with a lot of questions that I wasn't able to answer. Down here, you guys don't get enough credit. Our heart disease prevention staff, I was constantly in your hair, using your equipment, filling up your schedule. You were so flexible with me, and I really appreciate that. And then last, and certainly not least, of course, are my friends, my family, and obviously all the GTAs. This is a family, for sure. And I could not have done any of this without you guys. So, okay. That'll take questions. Yeah, Miles?
So the vitamin D deficiency you talked about earlier.
Yep.
So you reported like 49% males
Yep.
not getting enough vitamin D. But then you also said a lot of cyclists supplement with vitamin D. So.
Yeah, so that wasn't 49% of males not getting enough. That was the mean amount that all the males were getting. So on average, males were getting under 50% of the recommended daily vitamin, and that takes into account the supplements.
Right. So where do you think that deficiency is coming from? They're supplementing?
That's a great question. So as we know, the guys ingested a lot more total kcal than the females, and I think that helps buffer it a little bit because you did see their vitamin D levels were higher than females. But I couldn't tell you. I don't know if it's just we assume that we're getting so much in the sun, especially here in Fort Collins on a good year. You can be outside riding 300 days. It's awesome. But I don't think that part of it I think is education. When I told them their first round of dietary logs, so many participants were like, "What? This can't be correct. There's no way I'm not getting this amount of vitamin D." This is based on the information you gave me, so I think a little bit of it is an educational piece. So, yeah, Matt?
With the vitamin D, would you consider doing an actual plasma vitamin D measure to
awesome.
kind of help account for it? There's obviously this dietary limitation, but
sure. Something that's interesting to know is that the literature is very mixed on whether vitamin D and calcium supplementation even matter. So it's really about 50-50, especially in the cycling world. A lot of people have done studies on mega doses, essentially, of vitamin D and calcium to see if it can attenuate the bone loss seen in certain populations. Some say it does, and some say it doesn't. So I don't really know what the importance is of vitamin D and calcium yet, and I don't think other people do either. So that would be a good way to answer that question. Yeah, Dr. Miller.
I understand the difficulty in measuring the interior architecture of the bone itself.
Sure. We don't have a
Anybody just even
PCT.
look exteriorly at the bone to see if it's different? I mean,
Like external bone geometry?
yeah, like the femur and the tibia in a cyclist, is there, more bone deposition at tendon sites and less other place and that kind of thing?
Yeah, and that's a very interesting thought. They're actually, so a PQCT does let you look at the distal tibia and fibula, kind of chops your lower leg in half. And it lets you look at not only the whole radius, the diameter of the bone, but also the internal architecture to see what the inside of the bone looks like as well. And there have been some studies that have looked at that all the way up those long bones, and they do see that closer to those muscle attachment sites, bone density is a little greater, and then it's a little thinner in the middle of the bone. So that's, I don't know this for sure, but I would guess that if you were to look at like a femur of a cyclist and a femur of a weightlifter, you'd see greater density in the middle for the weightlifter versus the cyclist. But I don't think it's a safe assumption to say that the heads of the long bones would look any different.
So the question being, is bone mineral density the right outcome?
Absolutely, and a lot of people disagree that they don't think that DEXA is the best way to measure this. Unfortunately, a lot of people don't have a PQCT. They're not cheap. A lot of people do have DEXA, so it happens to almost be like a measure of ease, but at the same time, I think that the majority, it gives you good whole body, but it's not going to answer the question that you're specifically asking is, where is the density? So hopefully, like in Oklahoma, hopefully I can answer that question that you have a PQCT I'll be using. Yeah.
Your sex hypothesis.
Yes.
I'm curious if you have any thoughts on why your findings were contrary to your initial
I do. This is not scientific whatsoever. I think that when all of us think of osteoporosis, we instantly think women. We do not think men. So the public awareness of bone health is probably heightened in women. Also, we found a lot more of my female participants did report supplementation, even though their numbers didn't necessarily suggest that. So for me, I would think that means they're a little bit more cognizant of their bone health. Okay, maybe they're seeing it in their sisters, they're seeing it in their mothers, their grandmothers, and so maybe they're trying to do more weight-bearing activities and things like that as compared to the males. We don't really think of low bone health or low bone mineral density in guys. It's not that prevalent of an issue.
So the males reported a greater number of miles.
They did.
Do you think that might come into play? Have you thought about controlling for that?
That would be, yes, again, it's self-report, and again, I think just seeing all of the data, some of the guys' estimates were ridiculous, like not possible. So that was great. It would be good to control for miles because I think just personally that the amount of time you're on the bike that you're spending in a high intensity cycling is a huge factor in this, that we weren't maybe necessarily able to tease out as well as I would have liked with our statistics. So if you could control for that, I think it might clean a couple of things up. Yeah, and not only mileage, but also the intensity that they ride. So that would be harder to get out.
I
But
think the lines between male and female get blurred in cyclists.
yes, and that, I did find like the body fat. That's a big deal, right? That is the biggest difference between the males and females on paper, in terms of their its body fat. And I did just recently find some more research that suggested that increased body fat can actually. There's two trains of thought. One is that you weigh more, so it's going to force you to have a stronger skeleton right off the bat. So you're going to have greater bone mineral density the heavier you are. But then another train of thought is that with increased fat mass, some of that fat is actually being deposited into the bone, and it's increasing low bone mineral density. So I definitely need to do a lot more research on that because I'm fascinated. I just found this the other day. Fat in the bone, it like blew my mind. So that needs to be, like I said, teased out a little bit better. Yeah, Dr. Tracy.
Right before your first summary slide, there were a couple of p-values that flashed up there, 0.05 and 0.053, and I want to get a sense of how important they are to the big picture.
Sure.
Uh,
So do you remember if it was in sex?
Can you, the the red one, right? So
Yeah, T-score.
can you talk about that for a second?
Absolutely. So this is where I think all of those little factors, we talked about how mixed bike I thought was a big issue, and the fact that there was a lot more mixed bike racers than there were road racers. And we found that the mixed bike racers had a lot more experience, they reported more miles, they just seemed to be a more competitive group in general. And I think that a lot of those are underlying factors that play into this number being as low as it is. It didn't reach statistical significance, like we said we think it would have had we not excluded those 2 mixed bike racers. But I think the biggest things that don't show up statistically that are playing into this number is mileage and is the time they're spending on the bike, because that was different between them and the road racers.
So this is mixed bike racers having a greater,
So mixed bike racers have a lot more experience. Okay, but then if this had been significant, I would have put mixed bikes up here because, well,
a greater
yeah, they
bone
actually
density.
had
Bone
a
mineral.
lower bone mineral
Oh,
density.
lower.
Yeah, so the road racers would have a higher value. So mixed bike racers, it seems like the more years they're riding, their bone mass is going down. Does that make sense?
Okay. Contrary to what you
Right.
predicted.
Right,
Okay.
because there have been a number of studies that show, for instance, upper body BMC and bone mineral density is greater in mountain bikers than it is road racers. All of the jarring that they're doing, is translating that force through their long bones of their arms. So it's the same idea as the legs, and they have greater upper body bone density than road racers. So we didn't think it was such a stretch, to hypothesize that road racers would have the lowest bone density.
So maybe the other 0.5 value that you brought up there a couple slides later was for some sort of correlation that you described as not significant? I could be wrong, and I'm sorry.
That's okay. If you see it, holler at me.
It's like a single value.
This one?
Yeah.
This was just,
What's this?
this is a correlation, and the change in BMI was positively correlated to the change in T-score, but it was not significant.
Yeah, so that's not it's not a p-value.
Right,
it's
that's a
it's
correlation.
an R. It's an R value.
Okay, thank you.
Got it. Yeah, Dr. Brown.
I missed the first couple of minutes, so I
That's okay.
apologize if this is redundant, but I mean, nobody's really blaming the bike itself, right? There should be other sports where people are weight supported and produce high forces. Do we see this in other sports that are similar to cycling but aren't actually cycling?
Yes, but not as much. So, for instance, a lot of people instantly pick on swimmers because swimmers are another non-weight supporting activity. But there's something going on with cyclists more specifically that we see a lower bone mineral density in the cyclists than we do the swimmers.
I've got a question to that.
So it's funny you bring that up. I just did DEXA scan someone who's been riding their whole life, and they had lower upper body density, and this particular woman had an awesome lumbar BMD, which makes sense. The seat contact on the saddle every time if you're coasting or however you're riding. But I haven't found literature on that. That's just from the one person I just scanned. You got it? Chris?
How much does the duration of your average, sort of cycling event or exercise bout play into this? So,
You mean like how long you go for a ride?
Yeah, so typically if you go for a ride, a lot of times they'll be longer, especially if you're, on the lower category too. So is it necessarily that you're not weight bearing, or is you're not weight bearing for a really long time? So with the swimming, typically it's a lot shorter bouts, right?
Sure,
So
yeah.
you're not weight bearing.
Especially our most competitive cyclists, they might be on the bike upwards of 40 hours a week. It's their job. You know what I mean? And then, unfortunately, once they're on the bike for that long, they're exhausted, and then they're completely non-weight bearing for the rest of the day. They try to minimize everything else. And so there's a lot of auxiliary factors that when they're on the bike that long, what they're not doing the rest of the day also seems to play a role, but the research on that is very difficult to actually quantify, so it's really minimal. But I would definitely, if I had hypothesized that if there was some way that we could actually measure how much time your seat's in the saddle, I would say that the longer periods of time would correlate to a lower bone density, just based on what I've read in the research. That is not what our study would suggest.
So similar question. So has anyone done a study with people who are not weight bearing for the same amount of time, but also not physically active?
Sure, like sedentary controls.
Yeah, sort of sedentary control.
In fact, sedentary controls are often used in a lot of these studies, and I think, of course, use sedentary controls because it's going to make the difference much bigger and your data more sexy, pretty much. But I don't think that unless you were looking at like bed rest patients or something like that who's completely sedentary, And we do want to, I mean, realize that just because someone's on a bike doesn't mean that there's not forces, you know, being generated, right? There's muscle forces, you hit a bump, there's still vibrations up through the bike itself. Something I think is really interesting is these awesome mountain bikes now that are full suspension, especially the downhills. You can ride off of the table and not feel that much of a force anymore. So it'd be interesting to see if their bones are, you know, how much force those skeletons are going through versus road racers. So, yeah.
I think there's the assumption that cabins spend a lot of time on the bike is not always true, as you probably know, because masters, especially, there's a lot of your Cat 1 and 2s will be masters.
Right.
We're lucky to get 10 hours a week,
Sure.
kind of thing. So I mean and some of that came from experience and years of experience and different training styles. So I think that teasing out of category, time, age would probably give you some insight.
And intensity, I think. You might only get 10 hours on the bike a week, but your 10 hours might be greater for gaining aerobic fitness because of your intensity that you work out at versus a Cat 4 who's on the bike for 20 hours a week, but is only riding at 60% of their VO2 max or something like that.
Yeah, it's well known phenomenon. It's called master's training. Either you're going super hard or super easy, right? You have that time.
Neil?
So have you looked into getting data like Dr. Miller suggests? Because most pro cyclists are using bike computers, that is, tracking their mileage, how fast they're going. All those factors are actually available. Most of them are tracking them themselves. How easy would that be to get?
That's a good question. I don't know. I haven't looked into it. It would be interesting to see. I do want to point out that some of our Cat 1s, we had so Cat 1 is the top, but we had Cat 1s who traveled around the world, and we had Cat 1s who never hardly raced out of the county. So even within our Cat 1s and our professionals, we see a pretty large range. I mean, I had a couple of people who, like I said, unfortunately had to delay their scans because they were still overseas for like another 3 weeks racing. So that's something that would be, like I said, like Dr. Miller said, be important to try and control, really tease out, is it a Cat 1 issue or is it actually an intensity issue?
So you said the road cyclists had higher road density if you weren't correct.
They had what?
They had higher density, right?
Yeah.
I know you didn't measure physical activity levels outside, but just in terms of self-report, do they tend to be runners in the off-season more than those mixed bike cyclists?
So the road racers actually, for the most part, which again goes against my hypothesis, was they actually reported less auxiliary physical activity. And again, this is all self-report. I pretty much asked them, you know, please list the sort of activities that you do, you know, on a weekly basis. So some people would say, I do CrossFit 3 times a week, or I run or do yoga twice a week. So obviously it's not a very objective measure, but for the most part we actually found that mixed bike racers not only tended to ride more, but they also tend to do more activity, which is a counter to what we saw. Yeah,
I actually just have a question about your exclusion criteria. How come you got rid of the females with irregular periods?
Well, we know that sex hormones have to do with, you know, bone balance essentially, and we just didn't even want to mess with it. When women become amenorrheic, it can just wreak havoc on a wide variety of tissues, and so it's not even worth trying to control for that or something. So we weren't low on numbers, so it was just a lot easier. And most of the studies we tried to follow their methodology. It was also one of the first things they brought up was do not admit women with irregular menstrual cycles. So.
Okay, well, I think that we've grilled Bree enough here. I think you've done a fantastic job deflecting your inquiries or answering them. So anyway, I would like to thank you all for coming.
Let me pick this up.
We had